Vielen Dank. So I will speak in English. Thank you so much for this very kind presentation. I will share my screen. So I hope, can you all see it? Yeah, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, good. So I just have to move your pictures, otherwise I won't see my screen. Okay. So I will talk today about Schelling and the need for a metaphysics of nature. And you see that I will be here, I'll make a certain dialogue with what Eve spoke from a very different perspective and to defend a very different thesis also. And I will also engage a little bit with what Levin jetzt now spoke, because it was a surprise that he mentioned a point, and you see that I would also talk about it. So the center of the focus of this presentation is this notion of metaphysics of nature. And what I want to understand is, what is metaphysics of nature from this Kantian and then Schellingian perspective, and why do we need it? Why would we need something like that, something like a metaphysics of nature? And you can see here the overview of the presentation. So I'll make a brief introduction, and then I will go and explore a little bit deeper this notion of metaphysics of natural science, which is not the same as metaphysics of nature, but you see the transformation of this notion in this transition from Kant to Schelling. And then I will explore these two notions that are somewhat connected in the notion of metaphysics of nature and the notions of science and philosophy. And so I'll explore the notion of science and the question of interpretation, the notion of philosophy and the question of application. And in the end, I'll try to spell out my thesis or the thesis in which I've been working on based on the whole presentation. So the central problem of this presentation is, what is for Schelling a metaphysics of nature, and why does he think we need it? And I'll try to situate this problem within the landscape of interpretations of Schelling, or at least a certain cut of this landscape of interpretations. So Schelling's philosophy of nature is usually and traditionally read as a sort of misconception of transcendental philosophy, right? He's presented as the philosopher that thought a kind of metaphysics of the world. So you can see that in Charles Taylor, you can see that in Pippin. And he's also seen as this philosopher that presented a sort of speculative enterprise completely detached from experience. And you can see this image in Reinhard Laut and Michael Vater. So from this perspective, as a misconception of transcendental philosophy, Schelling's philosophy of nature would be a sort of double failure. A failure in relation to philosophy, because it would be a return to dogmatic metaphysics, and a failure in relation to science, because it would be a speculative enterprise completely detached from empirical challenges. A second way of reading Schelling, which is also becoming again quite present in the literature, I would say, is to see in Schelling a sort of overcoming of transcendental philosophy. So not a misconception, but an overcoming, because he would expose the metaphysical presuppositions of transcendental philosophy. You can see this reading in Zahnkaulen. There is a volume of the Fichte Studien, the 25, I think, which is completely dedicated to this controversy between Fichte and Schelling, and she defends their point of view that goes in this direction. You can see that also in this very nice book from Schwenzfeuer. He goes also a little bit in this direction. And in the very famous book of Ian Hamilton Grant, Philosophies of Nature After Schelling, where he presents Schelling's philosophy of nature as a sort of undoing of the Copernican revolution. So the anti-Kantian par excellence, we would say. So, and there is a third way of reading Schelling, because if you consider the first both interpretations, they go in the direction of an opposition to Kant's transcendental philosophy, be it in the negative sense or in the positive sense. And the third way to see Schelling's philosophy of nature, to read it, is to understand it as an attempt to address legitimate problems originated in Kant's transcendental philosophy. And we can read it, for instance, as Eckhard Förster does it in his beautiful book, The 25 Years of Philosophy, where he presents Schelling's philosophy of nature as this attempt to solve a legitimate problem originated there in Kant's philosophy, but with a defective method, according to Förster. And this method would be the intellectual intuition. But there is also another way of reading Schelling as trying to solve those Kantian problems, so to say, but not using a defective method, but using a method that we should explore a little bit more in order to understand it better. And I see this reading mostly in Di Giovanni in a paper. I can give you all the references later, and Frederick Beiser in his also very nice book on German idealism. So my thesis, my claim here is that on one hand, I will follow the literature, this third group of the literature, and I will state also that Schelling's philosophy of nature is an attempt to address a legitimate philosophical problem originated in Kant's philosophy. But as a novelty, I would like to go a step further, and I will propose that by further engaging with Schelling's Kantian background and his reception of the science of his time, we could see his philosophy as a sort of attempt to interpret the scientific challenges of his time. And this attempt to interpret those challenges will eventually lead to reconceptualize philosophy as such, to rethink what philosophy actually is. So we go now to the second point of our of the talk, and it is the metaphysics of natural science from Kant to Schelling. And here you see what I meant with the communication with Leving's presentation. Kant presents in his in the Architectonic of Pure Reason a landscape or a picture of the system that he intended to build, and that he didn't do it. And this picture of the system is very similar to what Wolff was doing, Baumgarten, and the pre-Kantians. But of course, from a very different perspective, but the picture of the system is very similar, and I give you the reference there from the Critique of Pure Reason from the Architectonic. So what does he want to do? So he will subject metaphysics to a critique, and this critique would result in a sort of reconceptualization of general metaphysics that will be now understood as a transcendental philosophy, and also a reconceptualization of special metaphysics. And in this passage in the Architectonic, he will call it rational physiology. And there he will make a division between 4 disciplines of special metaphysics or rational physiology. And these 4 disciplines are rational physics, rational theology, rational cosmology, and rational psychology. So rational theology, cosmology, and psychology, we know that he will criticize them and only accept a positive meaning in them as a sort of using them as regulative principles, so to say. But he will not accept that those disciplines could offer us knowledge of objects, objects of possible experience. The only discipline within special metaphysics that would offer us some sort of knowledge of objects of possible experience is rational physics. And here we have the question, what is actually rational physics, even from a Kantian perspective? So I would be interested precisely in this part of the picture here. So the relation between philosophy or transcendental philosophy from a Kantian perspective, science, empirical sciences, and the third realm. But what is this third realm? What is actually rational physics? So Kant began to explore this third realm in his Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. We can later talk about it. Kant, in the beginning of the text, he will say that this text is not a text on rational physics, but it will contribute to the final product that he would later write, and he didn't do it, but it is working in this realm, in this third realm. It is contributing to the development of rational physics. And what does he try? What does he do that? Well, he tries to provide a metaphysical foundation of natural science, as the title says, but he focuses his investigation on the concept of matter. The concept of matter is the central concept of the whole metaphysical foundations. So what do we learn about this third realm when we read the Metaphysical Foundations? So as regards the method, this third realm is not entirely a priori as philosophy, but it's also not entirely empirical as science, but it is sort of in between the a priori and the empirical. And in the Metaphysical Foundations, he says, I will presuppose the empirical concept of matter, and then I will analyze it from the perspective of philosophy using the table of categories and so on. So it's really in the middle. As regards its object, the object of the Metaphysical Foundations, or the object of the third realm, is not knowledge as the object of philosophy. It is not experience as the object of science, but again, it is a kind of a third, and this is again a challenge, even from a Kantian perspective. What is this third? What is this matter? What is matter? And as we all know, it will really become a problem for the late writings of Kant, the notion of matter. So now the question, I have to move again your pictures because otherwise I cannot read. Okay, so the question is, if philosophy deals with the a priori possibility of knowledge, and if science deals with the different domains of knowledge already proved to be possible and legitimate, why exactly do we need a third realm? Why do we need it? What would this third realm provide us? Good. So let's try to understand what this third realm is from a Schellingian perspective, and I will focus exclusively on the first edition of the Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature. There is the first text of Schelling on the topic, so in 1797. And we can, in the discussion afterwards, talk about the changes afterwards, but I will focus on the first edition, okay? And there he says, the third realm in relation to philosophy. He says so that pure theoretical philosophy concerns itself only with the investigation into the reality of our knowledge in general, but the applied theoretical philosophy under the name of philosophy of nature would concern itself with a determinate system of our knowledge to be deduced from principles, and this system would be the system of experience as a whole. But what I would like to highlight here is this notion of application. So philosophy of nature is here presented as an application of pure theoretical philosophy, which makes sense when we think about this picture of general metaphysics applied to a special object. Then we have special metaphysics, and this metaphysics is the metaphysics of this specific object. But then Schelling relates this notion of this third realm also to science, not only to philosophy, but he relates it also to science. And again, in the preface of the first edition in 1797, he says, it is true that chemistry teaches us the elements of nature Physics will teach us these syllables of nature, and mathematics will teach us how to read nature. But we should not forget that philosophy would provide us, would help us interpret what we read. So the notion is we can read nature thanks to mathematics and thanks to these elements and symbols provided by chemistry and physics, but we can only kind of interpret what we actually read through this philosophy of nature. So it means that in relation to science, this metaphysics of nature would provide us a sort of interpretation of science. So the third realm is also both an application of philosophy and an interpretation of science. And now the question is, how do we understand these both notions? How do we understand application of philosophy and how do we understand the notion of interpreting science? So let's begin with the interpretation of science. Good. Interpreting science. The focus, it is very interesting that the focus of the ideas as it presented in the first edition is really the interpretation of science, much more than the application of philosophy. And Schelling says it himself. In the preface, again, he will say that from the introduction that he would write afterwards, we will see that my aim is not to apply philosophy to the doctrine of nature, but rather to let natural science emerge philosophically. So to let it emerge philosophically. And my philosophy is nothing else than natural science. So this is how he presents his philosophy, and he says then from the beginning, I don't want to apply philosophy, I want to interpret science. I want to let natural science emerge philosophically, and I propose to read this let it emerge philosophically as an interpretation of science. And then he will make it clear again in the introduction that his book is not intended to begin from the top, from the formulation of principles, but rather from the bottom. That is from experiences and from proofs of the previous systems. So, and what does it mean beginning from the bottom? It means beginning from the interpretation of science. And you see that the structure of the book goes really in this direction. We will see the structure now. But where to begin? If we start from the bottom, which science should offer the basis for the interpretation and why? Which science should we choose? And here it becomes really interesting in Schelling, in my opinion. So if you take the structure of the book, you see that the book is an engagement with Kant's theory of matter. This is very clear in the first 5 chapters in the second book. But this engagement with Kant's theory of matter occurs within an overall attempt to develop a philosophy of chemistry. So the first 3 chapters you will see, so here in the middle, you see it is a dynamical theory of matter in blue, and in red, you see that the first 3 chapters on burning, light, and air, Schelling presents all those notions as explicitly related to chemistry. And he says, this is a matter of chemistry. And in the end, he will, of course, develop his philosophy of chemistry, and all the last chapters have chemistry in their title. So you can see that it is really a sort of, let's try to understand what chemistry is doing. And so the question is, why chemistry? Why did he choose this science in particular to make his interpretation of science, or to make his attempt to let natural science emerge philosophically? There are some reasons. One of them is quite important, but it will not be the reason in which I will focus. So the first of them, in which I will not focus, is the problem of the scientific character of chemistry. It is really, it is very famous, all this distinction between proper and improper science that Kant makes in the Metaphysical Foundations. And there he will not recognize chemistry as proper science. So there is a huge discussion in the Kantian reception. I will not enter into that, but it is important because Schelling will explicitly engage with Kant's approach to chemistry in the ideas. But I would like to focus in a second point. And this point is Schelling's attempt to understand nature in movement, or to understand nature in its becoming. And it's very interesting because already in the preface, if you pick really the first sentence, Schelling will say that the human, if you want to understand the human interventions within nature, we have to understand the way in which nature itself unfolds itself. Because it's only by means of understanding the way in which nature unfolds itself that man can understand how he can relate to it. And then he begins to explore this notion of nature unfolding itself. And he says, I want to understand how a force can acquire prevalence over the others and cause material dissolutions. And these material dissolutions will enable the emergence of new matter, of qualitative distinctive matter. So he says, we will focus our observations, our investigations of nature. We will open our investigations of nature in the best possible way by investigating this main process of nature through which bodies are destroyed and dissolved. So he's really focused in these dissolutions, in these destructions, and these destructions and dissolutions will enable the emergence of new combinations. So it's really an exploration of dissolutions and emergences, of destructions and new combinations. And it's really interesting because the way he defines the concept of chemistry later on the book will be precisely in this direction. He will say chemistry is an empirical science which teaches us how a free play of dynamic forces is possible, so that nature can enable new connections and also suppress previous connections. So he's really focusing this enabling new connections and dissolving previous connections. Or, as he will put it later, chemistry is that science that observes matter in its becoming. And this is the focus. It is observing matter in its becoming. So chemistry is a science of becoming. And I will argue that this is the reason why Schelling is focusing here on chemistry. So let's try to understand what does he extract from this engagement with this science of becoming? What do we learn about the third realm between science and philosophy when we engage with the science of becoming? So becoming can only be explained, according to Schelling, based on a dynamical concept of matter. And this is the main kind of the main thesis of the book that will connect the first and the second book. The first book is an engagement with the science, and the second book is the philosophical one. So we have to conceive matter as this product of the opposing forces of attraction and repulsion, which is Kant's thesis in the Metaphysical Foundations. But Schelling uses this Kantian thesis in the Metaphysical Foundations to say this is the only way that we can understand chemistry as a science, which Kant obviously does not do there. So the first result is that Schelling will understand this empirical science of becoming, chemistry, as applied dynamics. And he will say it explicitly, chemistry is applied dynamics. The second point that he tries to extract from this engagement with chemistry is to say, becoming, when we explore becoming, we will see that becoming is both. It is a contingency, because it is the dissolution and emergence of qualitative properties, and qualities, according to Schelling here, can only be experienced through sensation and he does associate those qualities to contingency, it is difficult to connect that with what he does afterwards, but we can talk about it afterwards. And the second point is it presupposes a necessary structure. So it's really this point of articulation between contingency and necessity. And in which sense it presupposes a necessary structure according to Schelling, because it presupposes the schema of a material object containing matter capable of becoming. So we need the schema of a matter capable of becoming. And this schema would be necessary, and it would provide us with the ground for understanding what happens in chemistry as contingency. And this schema is offered, of course, by the pure theory of dynamics. So the second result of this engagement is to say that chemistry is dynamics thought in its contingency. So the third realm would be, if we follow Schelling here, the realm that is dealing with the structure of becoming. So the connection between philosophy and science, it would be the exploration of a third realm, and this third realm is the realm exploring the structure of becoming. Very good. So let's go to philosophy now and the question of application. And here it becomes, again, very interesting. So we have seen that the third realm between philosophy and science is an interpretation of science and an application of philosophy. Well, as an interpretation of science, it results in a dynamical theory of matter. That's what we have seen. But the question is, how to understand this third realm as an application of philosophy? And there is apparently a very straightforward interpretation, and it would be, so we would read it from the top to the bottom. So philosophy applied to a special object, in this case, nature. So philosophy of nature. We understand what philosophy is, and then we apply it to an object. So it would be really from the top to the bottom. That would be a way of interpreting it. A second way, and it is very interesting that Schelling hesitates in the ideas, and we saw it, that he tries to give this priority to the bottom-up approach. He says in the introduction, I quote again, it's the same quote, "My aim is not to apply philosophy to the doctrine of nature, but rather to let natural science emerge philosophically." So the philosophy of nature, when we read it that way, the notion of philosophy here in philosophy of nature, the philosophy of nature would be philosophy, not because it is general philosophy applied to a special object, but because it emerges philosophically out of an engagement with sciences. So there is a different way of understanding what philosophy would be here when we try to understand it as this philosophical emergence of something. And in the ideas, Schelling will do it really in that he will really hesitate between both approaches. We can see, for instance, from the perspective of the application, that he will use Kant's paralogisms and apply it to the notion of matter. And he will really just take it from the critique of pure reason and apply it as such to the notion of matter. And he builds a very interesting argument to say that just as the eye of transcendental philosophy, when we abstract it from its actions, activities, is nothing, the same should work for matter. And he says, when we abstract matter from these opposing forces that constitutes matter, matter would be nothing. So it will be just matter and soul would be similar. The soul, it's only its forces, and matter would be also only its forces. But forces here understood in a very different way, of course. And it plays a very special role in his theory of becoming, this application of the paralogism, because, of course, he's trying to, so to say, to deconstruct the notion of thing and try to understand always the activity behind the constitution of things, so that matter would be nothing but the constant deployment of those forces, just as the eye would be nothing as the constant deployment of activity. But from a second perspective, not from the application, but from the emergence, Schelling also uses the table of categories, and it's very interesting the way in which he uses in the first edition of the Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, because he mentions the table, but he does not use it along the book directly, but we can see it emerge. And it's very interesting the way in which it will be emerging, but only the titles of quantity and quality. So the table will not be directly employed in the text, but we will see that he will try to show that pure dynamics provides us the categories of quantity, whereas applied dynamics would provide us with the categories of quality. So it would really be a sort of slow emergence of the categories throughout this analysis of becoming. Of course, this analysis kind of harmonizes with Kant's identification of the categories. But it also progressively engenders an element of tension within it, because now he will try to understand the emergence of the categories, which of course is not what Kant does, because Kant presupposes the table of judgments, and then he can go to the categories he wants to. So a philosophy of becoming. So we can see that from this approach, from the second approach of letting the natural science emerge philosophically, we will see that this notion of emergence will progressively assume the priority of the notion over the notion of application. And the third realm will be conceived as a sort of dynamic or speculative physics. And here, again, it's interesting to associate the speculative physics here, not only with Spinoza, like everyone does, but with rational physics, which Kant uses in the Critique of Pure Reason. So how do we understand this speculative physics in this relation to what Kant was trying to do that as the definition of the third realm? So this process culminates in Schelling's draft of the general deduction of the categories of physics. And in the general deduction, he will precisely say that dynamics is for physics exactly the same as what transcendental is for philosophy. And to explain something dynamically in physics is the same as explaining something transcendentally in philosophy. So what does that mean? It means what, from this perspective, from this interpretation, what does it mean to explain something transcendentally and dynamically? It would be to trace the result back to the activities that rendered it possible. And we do it in transcendental philosophy, and we do it according to Schelling in the dynamics. So we take matter as it is, or as it is becoming, and we try to trace it back to all of those activities that are rendering possible everything that we are experiencing. It is very interesting that in Kant's obituary, and here is 1804, so there is already a lot of other books that Schelling wrote on the philosophy of nature, but we will be back to this point, and he will say once again, and here very, very clearly in relation to Kant's philosophy, he will say, to his critique, to this theoretical critique of reason as the formal side, Kant added later his metaphysical foundations of natural science as, so to say, the real side. So he really tries to understand the critique of pure reason as the formal and the metaphysical foundations as the real. And here, of course, we will see the split afterwards. And he will try to read the empirical science of becoming in relation to both, in relation to dynamics and in relation to transcendental philosophy. And of course, associating different qualities to different titles of the categories to it, which is also very cool, because in the general deduction, he will deduce mostly the categories of quantity and quality. And if you take the system of transcendental idealism, he will use exclusively the title of relation. So we have three titles, and we just need modality, and we will have all the categories of Kant. So now the conclusion, and now it will be really quick. So from a Schellingian perspective, and that was my question from the start, what is a philosophy of nature, or what is a metaphysics of nature, and why do we need it? So what is it? Originally, it is a third realm between philosophy and science, a realm aiming at interpreting science and applying philosophy, even though it is most focused on the interpretation of science. And it eventually results in a theory of the process of becoming. Eventually, it will also evolve to a philosophical approach to becoming. But why do we need it? Why do we need this sort of approach? So we needed to address conceptual needs arising from the scientific praxis. And this conceptual needs in his time was to understand chemistry scientifically. But this engagement with the scientific challenges of the time can also eventually lead to challenge the philosophy of the time as such. And so to bring us to the necessity of understanding philosophy otherwise. So thank you very much.